What would you do if, high above the clouds, someone decided you didn't belong just because of the color of your skin? Imagine sitting in first class, calm, dignified, ready for a long flight. You've worked hard for that seat. But then, a flight attendant, armed with years of authority and prejudice, singles you out. No words at first, just cold looks, clipped tones, and finally, a shocking act that drenches not just your clothes, but your dignity. Now imagine the twist that passenger, quiet and composed, isn't just anyone. She is Elena Carter, a woman of strength, vision, and grace married to the very CEO of the airline. In minutes, the balance of power shifts. One act of cruelty sparks a chain reaction that will not only end a career, but also ignite a movement. But here's the question. Was this instant justice or an abuse of power? What happens when truth collides with lies in front of a watching world? And what does dignity truly cost at 35,000 feet? Stay with us as we dive into a story of prejudice, power, and redemption that will leave you questioning everything. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss stories that matter. The cabin lights glowed with that soft golden hue that airlines use to suggest comfort, even when you're sealed inside a pressurized tube 35,000 feet above the earth. Horizon Pacific Airlines. Flight 843 was preparing for its cross-country run from Miami to Seattle. The first-class cabin, just 16 wide leather seats across 4 neat rows, had that polished hush of money. Passengers murmured in low tones, tapping on phones, sipping champagne. For some, this was routine. For others, it was indulgence. For one woman, it was simply another space to breathe. Elena Carter had chosen her seat, 1A, with purpose. It was quiet, tucked against the window, where she could press her thoughts against the glass and sketch the world outside. She traveled often, her work as an architectural designer taking her across continents. This flight was no exception. She had a journal open on her lap, its thick cream pages already filled with ink sketches, sweeping arcs of glass ceilings, the curl of staircases, a half-formed design for a civic center. Her pen moved slowly, not hurried, as though she was listening to something only she could hear. Her presence was striking without being loud, a tailored ivory pantsuit, pressed without a wrinkle, hair braided intricately, resting over one shoulder. No oversized jewelry, no flashy logos, just quiet elegance, the kind that made strangers curious and colleagues cautious. She sat with the poise of someone who knew she belonged, but didn't feel the need to announce it. Across the aisle, Senior Flight Attendant Susan Whitfield adjusted the cuff of her crisp Navy uniform. Her hair, blonde pulled into a tight bun, framed a face hardened by 22 years of service. She had once loved this job, the freedom of the skies, the novelty of new cities. But over time, the novelty thinned, and what remained was a rigid sense of ownership. This was her domain, her palace in the sky, and every passenger was a subject. Some she doted on, others she tolerated, and then there were the ones she judged before they even spoke. Her eyes landed on Elena. Her lips tightened, just slightly, under her breath, in a whisper meant for no one else. She muttered, "Oh, of course. She's in first class." It wasn't just a comment, it was a verdict. Her mind, conditioned by years of quiet biases, drew its conclusion before Elena had lifted her head from her journal. This passenger didn't fit the silent profile she believed first class demanded. Susan didn't know her story, but she had already written it. Next to her, Rachel Kim, the junior flight attendant assigned to the same cabin, caught the faint murmur. Rachel was 26, knew enough to still feel awe when she stepped into an aircraft, hopeful enough to believe kindness should be the baseline. She turned her bright eyes towards Susan. "What was that?" she asked lightly, adjusting the row of champagne flutes on her tray. Susan forced a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Nothing. Sweetie, just making sure we have enough of the good champagne for our valued guests." Her tone carried an edge, subtle but unmistakable. Valued guests. The words hung in the air like a private joke. Only she understood. Rachel glanced toward seat 1A, where Elena was quietly sketching, and felt a flicker of unease. But she didn't press. She was still new, still learning which silences to keep. As the last passengers boarded, Susan's performance began, with the silver-haired gentleman in 2B, Mr. Ross. She bent low, laughed at his quip, and offered an oversized dish of warm nuts, a little above the standard service. With the couple in row 3, she recommended a Pinot Grigio with their meal, a conspiratorial tone in her voice as though she were sharing a secret. To everyone else, she radiated warmth. But each time her steps drew her past 1A, something shifted. A chill followed her movements, subtle enough for most to miss, sharp enough for Elena to notice. Elena requested her first drink softly. "Sparkling water with a slice of lime, when you have a moment." She didn't look up from her sketch, her voice calm as silk. Susan tilted her head, as though caught off guard. "Just water?" she asked, a note of surprise tucked inside the words, as if Elena were foolish for refusing the free champagne. Elena lifted her gaze only briefly, smiled faintly, and repeated, "Sparkling water, please. When you have a moment. When you have a moment." The phrase echoed in Susan's ears. To Elena, it was nothing more than politeness. To Susan, it sounded like entitlement, like a command disguised as civility. Her smile tightened as she delivered the drink, placing it down with just enough force to make the liquid slosh. A few drops landed on the leather, but Elena said nothing. She simply reached for a napkin and dabbed the spill, her movements serene, unshaken. It was the quietness that unsettled Susan most. She wanted resistance, wanted some sharp word or irritated glare that would justify her disdain. Instead, Elena remained composed, her silence stronger than any protest. The more unbothered Elena seemed, the more Susan's irritation curdled. As the plane taxied, the hum of the engines filled the cabin. Elena turned her gaze to the window. The runway lights streaked by, then lifted into darkness as the plane climbed. For her, flying had always carried duality, freedom, and confinement, wonder and weariness. Tonight, as Miami disappeared beneath her, she thought of her projects waiting in Seattle, of the foundation she was building for young designers, of the people who believed in her. The world was heavy, but she carried it with grace. Susan, moving through the aisle with her service cart, watched her. To her, Elena wasn't elegance or vision. She was simply out of place, a symbol of something that rubbed against every disappointment Susan had collected over 2 decades in the sky. It wasn't turbulence outside the window that threatened to shake the cabin. It was turbulence brewing inside one woman, unseen by most, but ready to spill. And so, the stage was set. A cabin filled with strangers, each playing their quiet role. A woman of dignity and depth in seat 1A. A steward of bitterness walking the aisle. A junior attendant already uneasy. And a lawyer in 2B, observant, silent, recording details in the theater of his mind. Above them, the night stretched endless, the sky vast and unknowing. Within it, a single spark of prejudice was waiting to ignite. The steady thrum of the engine settled into the kind of background rhythm that lulled most passengers into quiet. A few slipped on noise-canceling headphones, others scrolled through movies, and some reclined into half-sleep. For Elena, it was a familiar sound, almost like the ocean waves she used to listen to as a child in Savannah. It reminded her of movement, of possibility, of leaving behind one world and entering another. She leaned back in her seat, her sketchbook open again, her pen tracing lines that hinted at the skeleton of a building not yet born. Susan watched her with a kind of simmering discontent. To any outside observer, she looked perfectly professional, poised with her tray and her controlled smile. But inside, her thoughts twisted. 22 years of service had left her with a chip on her shoulder the size of an overhead bin. She had seen passengers at their worst, demanding, entitled, dismissive. She had dealt with celebrities who snapped their fingers and executives who barked orders. And yet, in some way, Elena's calm irritated her more than the loudest complainer ever could. It wasn't noise. It was silence. A silence that seemed to mock her. To say, "I don't need you." When Rachel brought a hot towel service down the aisle, she stopped at seat 1A with a bright smile. "Miss Carter, would you like one?" Her tone was genuine, her respect natural. Elena smiled softly. "Thank you. That would be lovely." Rachel handed her the folded towel, still warm and releasing faint steam, and for a moment their eyes met. Elena's gaze was kind, but Rachel saw something else too, a hint of knowing. It was as if Elena could already sense the undercurrent in the cabin, the faint hostility from Susan, and yet she chose grace as her shield. Rachel moved on, but the unease she had felt earlier deepened. Susan caught the exchange from the galley and felt her stomach tighten. Rachel was too eager, too soft, too ready to be charmed. Susan prided herself on control, on knowing who deserved what kind of service. To her, hospitality wasn't equal. It was a ladder, and in her private hierarchy, Elena did not belong at the top. Half an hour into the flight, dinner service began. The carts rolled out, the aroma of roasted chicken and seared salmon filling the cabin. Susan leaned close to the couple in 3C and 3D, recommending the wine pairing in hushed tones, earning a grateful chuckle. When she reached 1A, her smile flattened. "And for you," she asked. Her voice clipped. Elena closed her sketchbook gently and looked up. "The salmon, please, and just a small glass of Chardonnay, if you have it." Her tone was measured, the kind of tone that invited respect without demanding it. "Of course," Susan said, though the words felt mechanical. She served the dish with a little more force than necessary, the plate clinking against the tray table. Elena's expression didn't change. She thanked her, adjusted her napkin, and continued reading the novel she had brought, its spine bent and familiar. Susan returned to the galley, her chest tight with frustration she couldn't name. Why does she get under my skin, she asked herself. It wasn't logical. Elena had been nothing but polite. But something about her composure felt unbearable. It reflected every insecurity Susan had buried: her stalled promotions, her strained marriage, her sense that life had somehow passed her by while she was pouring coffee at 35,000 feet. Rachel noticed her senior's stiffness. "Susan, you okay?" she asked carefully. "Fine." Susan answered too quickly. "Just fine. Focus on your rows." "Rachel." But Rachel wasn't convinced. She had heard the bite in Susan's tone earlier, had felt the difference in how she treated passengers. Most people might dismiss it as nothing. But Rachel had grown up watching her own mother navigate subtle slights in everyday life. She knew when kindness was genuine and when it was withheld. And here, she could see it clearly. Susan had marked Elena as a target. Meanwhile, in 2B, Daniel Ross, the lawyer, adjusted his glasses and pretended to be absorbed in the movie playing on his seat screen. In reality, he had been watching the interactions carefully. Years of courtroom training had sharpened his instincts for tension, and he recognized the kind that was building here. He made mental notes, body language, tone shifts, subtle aggression. He wasn't sure why, but something told him this would matter. The meal ended quietly. Plates were collected, lights dimmed, and the cabin settled into that suspended twilight that comes after dinner on a long flight. Most passengers reclined and closed their eyes. Elena kept her reading light on, a soft pool of illumination over her pages. The quiet hum of engines pressed in. It was then that Susan's thoughts took a darker turn. She poured herself a glass of water in the galley, the ice cubes clinking. Her reflection in the stainless steel wall looked stern, almost foreign. She told herself she was just doing her job, maintaining standards, keeping order. But the truth pressed at her. This wasn't about service. It was about control. And with Elena's composure, she felt she had none. Rachel, sensing the weight in the air, tried to break it. "You know," she whispered, "she's just reading quietly. She hasn't asked for much. Maybe let it go." Susan's eyes snapped to hers. "This is about anticipatory service. Rachel, something they clearly don't teach anymore. You give passengers what they need before they know they need it." Rachel wanted to argue, to say that Elena hadn't asked for anything, but the sharpness in Susan's gaze silenced her. She stepped back, unsettled. Susan lifted the glass of water again, heavier this time, and for a brief second her hand hesitated. "Why am I doing this?" she wondered. "Why does it matter inside?" A flicker of conscience tried to fight its way forward, reminding her that she was supposed to protect passengers, not target them. But the flicker was drowned by the swell of resentment that had been building for years. She told herself this would prove something, though she couldn't quite articulate what. In 1A, Elena felt the weight of eyes on her. She didn't look up right away. She had learned long ago that sometimes the greatest strength was not reacting, but she could feel the energy shifting, the silence thickening, the hum of hostility cloaked in professionalism. She set her book down for a moment and took a slow breath, centering herself. She thought of her husband, Adrian, likely in a late-night call somewhere, his voice carrying that mix of warmth and steel that had always steadied her. She thought of the foundation she was building, the young women who looked to her as proof that grace and brilliance could coexist. She reminded herself, hold steady. Do not let them define you. Susan stepped forward from the galley, the glass of plain water in her hand. Her smile was stretched thin, her voice rehearsed. "Passenger in 1A could use a refill," she said. Rachel's stomach dropped. She didn't ask for one. Her glass is still half full. Susan didn't answer. Her steps were deliberate, her pulse quickening. The ice shifted in the glass. In her mind, she convinced herself it was nothing, just a gesture of service. But beneath that fragile justification, something darker pulsed. Elena lifted her head just as Susan approached. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. In Elena's gaze was calm curiosity. No fear, no challenge, just steady presence. It was that look, more than anything else, that made Susan's grip tighten on the glass. And in that suspended second, before the act that would change everything, 3 people in the cabin felt the same tension for 3 different reasons. Rachel felt dread, sensing that something irreversible was about to happen. Daniel felt alert, his lawyer's instinct sharpening, silently preparing to bear witness. And Elena felt an odd stillness, as though she were standing at the edge of a storm she had no intention of feeding. The engines hummed on. The night stretched vast outside the window, and the air inside the cabin grew heavy with anticipation. The cabin was dim now, wrapped in the soft glow of reading lights and the muted flicker of seatback screens. The world outside was an endless darkness, broken only by faint stars scattered across the sky. Inside, the silence carried a tension no one could quite name, though a few could feel it in their bones. Susan's steps toward seat 1A were steady, practiced, like she was performing a routine she had rehearsed 1,000 times. But this wasn't routine. Her fingers tightened around the glass of water, the ice clinking softly against the rim. Each step carried with it a pressure that had been building for years, a resentment toward passengers who never knew her name, colleagues who got promoted ahead of her, a life that felt smaller than it once promised to be. Elena looked up as Susan approached, her book resting open on her lap. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but her eyes were sharp enough to cut through any pretense. In that one glance, she saw it, the tightness in Susan's jaw, the brittle smile, the forced warmth that carried the chill of something else entirely. Susan tilted her wrist. The water poured in a sudden rush, cascading down Elena's cream-colored blazer, soaking the fabric, splattering across the open book, scattering ice cubes across the seat and floor. The cold sting stole Elena's breath for half a second. She gasped quietly, more from the shock of the act than the water itself. The cabin, though mostly drowsy, stirred. A few passengers looked up, their faces puzzled. Rachel froze near the galley, her heart sinking into her stomach. Daniel Ross in 2B lowered his headphones, his lawyer's instincts kicking in. He had seen everything: the deliberate wrist flick, the absence of turbulence, the cold calculation. "Oh, my goodness," Susan exclaimed, her voice suddenly dripping with exaggerated concern. "I am so sorry. The plane just lurched. Are you all right?" Her tone was performative, a rehearsed show of innocence, but the plane hadn't moved an inch. The engines hummed steadily. There had been no lurch, no bump, no reason. Elena stood slowly, water dripping from her sleeve onto the carpet. She looked at Susan, not with rage, not even with shock anymore, but with a piercing disappointment that was somehow heavier than anger. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, unshakable. There was no turbulence. The words cut the air like glass. Susan's smile faltered, her mask cracking under the weight of truth. She stammered, "I must have lost my footing. These new shoes, slippery soles." She grabbed a fistful of napkins and reached forward. But Elena stepped back, her refusal calm but firm. "No, thank you," Elena said. "I think you've done quite enough." The authority in her tone pulled the attention of nearby passengers. A woman in 3C sat up straighter. "Mr. Ross removed his glasses, eyes fixed on the confrontation. Rachel gripped the galley counter, her knuckles white. Susan's performance faltered. Her cheeks flushed a mottled red. She raised her voice, trying to reclaim control. "Ma'am," I apologized. "It was an accident. If you'll let me clean it up, we can move on. There's no need to make a scene." "You made the scene," Elena replied without hesitation, her gaze unwavering. "You poured that water on me. The only question I have is why?" The directness of the accusation froze the air in the cabin. Passengers who had been pretending to ignore the situation were now openly watching. A couple paused their movie. A businessman halfway down the aisle pulled out his phone, uncertain whether to record. Susan bristled. "How dare you? I've been a flight attendant for 22 years. I would never." "Then 22 years of experience should have taught you how to carry a glass of water," Elena interrupted, her tone calm, cutting, undeniable. The words landed like a gavel. Susan's chest heaved, her eyes wide with fury. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had expected anger, yelling, a loss of control she could spin into unruliness. Instead, she got composure, logic, clarity. It unnerved her, infuriated her. Her voice rose. "Ma'am, you need to lower your voice. You're disturbing the other passengers." "My voice is perfectly level," Elena said softly. "You, however, seem agitated. Perhaps you should get your purser." It was a quiet strike, a reminder that Susan herself was the purser, and that she was failing in her role. Susan's rage spiked. She felt the last threads of her authority slipping through her fingers. "I am the authority on this aircraft," she hissed, "and I am telling you it was an accident. Now sit down, accept my apology, or this becomes a problem." The words hung in the air like a blade. Before Elena could respond, another voice cut through the cabin. Calm, deep, resonant. "It's already a problem. Susan." The heads of every awake passenger turned toward the front of the cabin. Standing in the archway that separated first class from the cockpit corridor was a tall man in a dark suit, his presence commanding enough to silence even the hum of the cabin itself. His eyes sharp, unblinking, moved first to Elena, soaked but steady, then to Susan, who looked suddenly very small. Elena's lips curved into the faintest smile of relief. "Adrian," she breathed, her composure softening for the first time. Susan's jaw slackened. Every employee of Atlantic Sky knew his face. Adrian Carter, the CEO, the man whose signature was on their paychecks, whose decisions shaped the very airline they served. She had seen him on magazine covers, in corporate training videos, in news segments about innovation and leadership. And now, impossibly, he was here, on her flight, watching her. "Mr. Carter, sir, Her voice faltered. Words clashed and died on her tongue. Adrian ignored her. He stepped to Elena's side, gently taking her hand in his. His voice, when he spoke, was stripped of corporate polish. It was the voice of a husband, tender and protective. "Are you all right?" Love Elena nodded slightly. "Just wet. Nothing more." But her eyes betrayed a flicker of vulnerability, the shock of being humiliated so publicly. Adrian's jaw tightened, his gaze hardening as he turned back to Susan. The shift in his expression was chilling. Gone was the warmth. What remained was pure steel. "Susan Whitfield," he said, each syllable landing like a verdict. Susan's face drained of color. "Sir, it was turbulence. I swear. I didn't." Adrian raised a hand, silencing her. His voice was cold enough to frost the cabin walls. "I've been standing here for 2 minutes. This aircraft hasn't moved an inch. I heard your explanation. I heard my wife's. And I saw enough." Susan's throat tightened. She searched desperately for support, glancing at Rachel, who stood frozen in the galley, her face pale with fear, but her eyes full of truth. She looked at Daniel Ross, whose gaze was level, calculating. There was no lifeline. Adrian stepped closer, his presence towering. "Look at me and tell me the truth," he demanded. Susan's lips trembled. It was an accident." Adrian held her gaze for a long, suffocating moment. He saw it all, the malice, the bitterness, the prejudice. And he made his decision. "Rachel," he said, not looking away from Susan, "you are now the lead for the remainder of this flight. Escort Miss Whitfield to a jump seat. Inform her she is on immediate unpaid leave under Section 4, Paragraph B, pending investigation." Susan's knees weakened. Immediate leave. She could survive that. The union would fight for her. But Adrian wasn't finished. His voice dropped, lower than before, stripped of all pretense. "That investigation is now complete. You are terminated, effective immediately." The 6 words sliced through the pressurized air with more force than turbulence ever could. Passengers gasped. Someone whispered, "Did he just fire her?" Susan staggered. You can't. You can't fire me here. Not now. I have union protection. Procedures." Adrian's eyes were merciless. Gross misconduct includes assaulting a passenger. That clause allows for summary dismissal. What you did wasn't an accident. It was malicious. And you did it to the wife of your CEO. Consider this your exit interview. He turned his back on her, a gesture more devastating than any insult, and wrapped his arm around Elena's shoulders. Susan's world collapsed in that instant. 22 years gone. Authority stripped. Reputation shattered, all undone by one reckless act, and the truth that refused to stay hidden. The cabin was silent. The passengers knew they had witnessed something irreversible, and Elena, though soaked and shaken, held her head high, her dignity intact. The silence that followed Adrian Carter's words was heavier than the aircraft itself, as though the cabin had dropped into a void where time no longer moved. Every passenger who had been awake or had stirred at the commotion now sat upright, eyes fixed on the aisle where Susan Whitfield stood frozen. Her hands trembled at her sides. Napkins still balled uselessly in one fist. Her crisp uniform dampened by sweat breaking through the fabric. "You can't do this," she whispered, though the sound carried in the hushed air. "Not like this. Not in front of them." Adrian did not turn back. His arm remained draped around Elena's shoulders, protective, but not performative. His silence was its own weapon, sharper than any rebuke. Susan's eyes darted wildly from face to face, searching for a trace of sympathy. She looked to Daniel Ross in 2B, but his gaze was stone cold, assessing, already etching her downfall into the record of his mind. She flicked her eyes toward Rachel, hoping the younger attendant might offer a lifeline. But Rachel stood stiffly, her expression pale yet resolute, torn between fear of defying her superior and the clarity of truth. I gave 22 years to this airline," Susan said, louder now. Her words pitched half toward Adrian's retreating figure, half toward the watching crowd. "I've sacrificed holidays, family, my health. You think you can erase that with 6 words?" Elena spoke then, her voice calm, but carrying an authority that resonated far deeper than Susan's protests. "You erased yourself? Susan, the moment you chose malice over decency, you surrendered everything you worked for." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't cruel, but the truth in her tone cracked whatever was left of Susan's defenses. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, some sympathetic to Elena, others awestruck by the sheer audacity of what they had just witnessed. A few already had phones in hand, not to record, but to send text messages via the onboard Wi-Fi. "You won't believe what's happening on this flight." Captain Harris emerged from the cockpit, his broad shoulders filling the aisle. He surveyed the scene, his pilot's calmness masking the current of unease running beneath. "Miss Whitfield," he said evenly, You will accompany Flight Attendant Kim to the aft jump seat. Now, if you refuse, I will have no choice but to authorize restraint under federal interference statutes." The word restraint sent a shiver down Susan's spine. She imagined plastic ties around her wrists, passengers watching as she was dragged like a criminal. The last fragments of her pride crumbled. With a brittle nod, she turned and walked stiffly down the aisle, Rachel following a half step behind to ensure compliance. The long walk was its own sentence. The murmured conversations, the sideways glances, the shame pressing down on her like cabin pressure gone wrong. In the forward galley, Adrian guided Elena to a dry seat, producing a blanket from the overhead compartment with surprising gentleness. His fury, which only moments earlier had burned white-hot, now settled into a simmering core of resolve. Elena leaned into him, whispering so only he could hear, "You didn't have to do it like that, in front of everyone." His jaw tightened. "Yes, I did." He kissed her forehead, a gesture that was tender but underpinned by conviction. "There are some lessons that must be delivered publicly. Quiet consequences would only have bred rumor. This way, there is no doubt about what happened or why." She sighed, weary. "You sound like the CEO again. And a husband," he said softly, pulling her closer. "Always both. Behind them." Daniel Ross cleared his throat politely. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, forgive the intrusion. My name is Daniel Ross. I'm an attorney. I was in 2B and witnessed the entire incident. If you need a written account or testimony, I'll be glad to provide it." Adrian turned, his expression softening briefly. "Thank you, Mr. Ross. Your professionalism means more than you know." He took the business card Daniel offered, sliding it into his breast pocket like evidence he already knew he would use. Back in the aft cabin, Susan collapsed into the hard jump seat, her body trembling. The reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. Terminated. Effective immediately. The words looped endlessly in her mind, louder than the roar of the engines outside. Rachel stood nearby, clutching the interphone with nervous fingers. She had never led a cabin before. The weight of authority felt like a jacket several sizes too big. Yet when she glanced towards Susan, she found a strange clarity. Leadership wasn't about being the loudest. It was about doing what was right, even when it shook you to your core. In the first-class cabin, passengers whispered in low tones, the event already shifting into legend. One man muttered, "I've never seen anything like that." Another shook his head, saying, "Took guts to fire her mid-flight." A woman leaned across the aisle to her husband, whispering, "That's why he's the CEO." Adrian, meanwhile, had already pulled a sleek black phone from his briefcase. With a few swift taps, he connected to the satellite line. A chime, then a voice. "Corporate communications. This is Elena Morales." "Linda," Adrian said, his tone clipped and professional now. "I need HR and legal assembled in San Francisco when we land. There's been an incident with Susan Whitfield. Gross misconduct. Termination issued on board." The line went silent for a beat. On board, Linda repeated. "Yes," Adrian said firmly. "I'll brief you fully on the ground. Prepare for possible PR escalation. We have multiple witnesses and likely recordings. I want our narrative airtight before the unions attempt spin." "Understood." "Understood, sir." He ended the call, sliding the phone shut with finality. Elena watched him, her brow furrowing. "You're already turning this into strategy." He nodded slowly. "Because she will. Whitfield won't accept this quietly. She'll scream victimhood. She'll paint herself as collateral damage to my ego or to your presence. If we don't control the narrative, she will." Elena's heart sank. "So it isn't over?" "No," Adrian admitted. "This was just the beginning." Rachel returned to the front, her steps hesitant. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "the cabin is secure. Miss Whitfield is seated in the back. Do you want me to log the incident in the in-flight report now?" Adrian gave her a long look, then nodded. "Yes, document everything. Every word she said, every movement. Leave nothing vague. That record will protect you as much as it protects us." Rachel swallowed hard but nodded. She pulled a tablet from the galley drawer and began typing, her hand steadier than she expected. As the hours passed, the cabin returned to a fragile semblance of normal. Meals were served, trays collected, lights dimmed once more. Yet the tension remained, woven into the recycled air like an invisible current. Every time a passenger's gaze swept toward 1A, it lingered a beat longer than before, as if to remind themselves they had not imagined it. Elena eventually drifted into a shallow sleep against Adrian's shoulder. He stayed awake, staring into the darkness beyond the oval window. His mind churned, not with doubt, but with calculation. He had acted as a husband first, defending the dignity of the woman he loved. Now, as CEO, he would defend the integrity of the company they had built their lives around. The two roles were inseparable, and he would not fail in either. Far aft, Susan sat rigid in her jump seat, every jolt of the aircraft rattling her bones like a cruel reminder. The hush of the cabin was unbearable, the knowledge that dozens of eyes saw her not as authority, but as disgrace. Rage simmered in her veins, twisted with humiliation. She told herself she would fight back. She would not let them take everything from her. And in that vow, silent but fierce, the seeds of the next storm began to sprout. The aircraft cut westward through the night, its passengers suspended between two worlds, the sky outside vast and endless, the lives within forever changed. The soft chime of the intercom signaled the captain's announcement, his voice steady but carrying a weight the passengers could sense. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into San Francisco. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, trays stowed, and seats in the upright position. We'll be on the ground shortly." The words were routine, but nothing felt routine inside that aircraft. The quiet buzz of descent, usually a time when travelers began to collect belongings or stretch stiff limbs, was instead marked by murmurs of speculation, sidelong glances, and the heavy awareness that everyone had witnessed something extraordinary. In the forward cabin, Elena shifted in her seat, brushing her fingers against the damp edge of her sleeve. Adrian reached for her hand again, his grasp warm, grounding her as though the turbulence of humiliation could still pull her under, even when the skies outside were calm. "You'll never forget this flight," she whispered, half to herself. Adrian's eyes didn't leave hers. Neither will anyone else. Across the aisle, Daniel Ross had his phone out again, not to surf the descent checklist of emails, but to finish a detailed set of notes. Each word carried timestamps, quotes, precise details, the instinct of a lawyer who knew the importance of a narrative secured before memory blurred. Every keystroke was the sound of a noose tightening around Susan Whitfield's defense. Far in the back, Susan's world was unraveling. The engine's low hum blended with the pounding in her ears. She tried to straighten her posture, to salvage some fragment of dignity. But the murmurs of passengers passing on their way to the lavatory seared her like branding irons. That's her. She dumped water on the woman in 1A, and her husband's the CEO. Every whisper stripped another layer from her armor. Her uniform, once crisp with authority, now clung to her like a costume from a role she no longer owned. She wanted to believe it was all a mistake, that the moment they touched the ground, she could explain it away, argue policy, cry turbulence. But the truth glared back at her, replaying in her mind with unbearable clarity the flick of her wrist, the icy splash. Elena's quiet words. There was no turbulence. The descent stretched endlessly. The slow tilt of the nose, the subtle rumble as flaps extended, the aircraft gradually surrendering altitude. For Elena, each moment closer to the ground was relief and dread intertwined. Relief that the ordeal was nearly over. Dread, because she knew the humiliation would echo beyond the landing, carried by whispers, by witnesses, by the cruel efficiency of the digital world. Rachel, stationed at the forward galley again, clutched the interphone as though it tethered her to sanity. Her training manual had never covered this, never prepared her to watch her mentor dissolve in disgrace. Yet even as her heart pounded, she recognized the truth authority meant nothing without integrity. She glanced at Adrian Carter, seated like a figure carved from iron, and understood with a chill that leadership also meant carrying consequences through to the very end. The wheels touched down with a thud, rubber-biting runway, engines roaring into reverse thrust. The cabin jolted, then steadied, the familiar chorus of rolling luggage and rattling trays filling the moment. Yet the silence layered over it remained, taut and expectant. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Harris said again over the intercom, "welcome to San Francisco. For those of you with connecting flights, please check the monitors inside the terminal. We ask that you remain seated as we arrive at the gate." His tone was steady, but those who knew him could hear the undercurrent of tension. He, too, had witnessed the scene in first class. The aircraft slowed, turning onto the taxiway, lights from the terminal spilling across the windows. Outside, the city shimmered in the night haze, unaware of the storm arriving on its doorstep. When the plane finally reached the gate, the seatbelt sign pinged off. Normally, the cabin would erupt with the rustle of passengers leaping to retrieve bags. Not tonight. Every passenger in first class remained seated, eyes forward, waiting. The crew had requested it. Something was about to happen, and no one wanted to miss it. The forward door opened, not to the usual smiling gate agent, but to two stern-faced airport security officers in navy jackets. Behind them walked a woman in a sharp business suit, her stride purposeful, her gaze like polished steel. She was Sarah Lynn, head of HR for Atlantic Sky's West Coast operations, and she had not come for small talk. Her heels clicked down the aisle as though striking a gavel. She paused in the middle of the cabin, her voice firm but courteous. "Passengers, thank you for your patience. Please remain seated for just a few more minutes while we resolve an internal matter. Your cooperation is appreciated." Guests whispered through the cabin. The spectacle was unfolding exactly as many had predicted. Sarah turned her gaze aft. "Miss Whitfield," she called, her tone professional, but leaving no room for evasion. "Please come forward." All eyes turned as Susan rose stiffly from the jump seat, her movements wooden, her face a mass drained of color. The aisle stretched before her like a gauntlet. Every step felt like trudging through quicksand, each passenger's eyes pressing upon her. Some were pitying, most were cold, and a few glimmered with satisfaction. As she reached the midpoint of the cabin, Sarah extended a folder. "Miss Whitfield, under the authority of Atlantic Sky Airlines and in accordance with company policy regarding gross misconduct, your employment is hereby terminated effective immediately. Please surrender your company ID, security badge, and keys. The words landed like hammer strikes. Susan's hands shook as she reached into her pocket, producing the plastic ID that had been her passport to identity for 2 decades. She handed it over with a numbness that bordered on disassociation. Sarah continued, her voice still professional, her eyes unwavering. "You will be escorted from the aircraft and property by security. HR will contact you within 72 hours regarding final pay and benefits. You are not to contact crew members or passengers regarding this matter. Do you understand?" Susan swallowed, her throat dry. "This is wrong," she managed, her voice cracking. "It was just an accident." Daniel Ross leaned slightly forward, his voice carrying with precise clarity. "There was no accident, and I will testify to that under oath if required." The words cut deeper than any dismissal. A lawyer, a witness, a truth she could no longer rewrite. Passengers murmured again, some nodding, others whispering into phones. The first sparks of virality were catching, invisible threads already weaving through networks outside the plane. Hashtags forming in minds, messages firing into group chats. Flight attendant fired mid-flight. CEO stood up for his wife. Susan's eyes brimmed with fury, humiliation, and despair all at once. But she said nothing further as the security officers flanked her, guiding her down the aisle. The walk of shame ended at the open door, where the night air spilled in cool and sharp. She disappeared into it, her figure swallowed by the fluorescent light of the jet bridge. Sarah turned back, her expression softening slightly as she addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. You are now free to deplane. Atlantic Sky apologizes for the disruption." The passengers rose, but even as they pulled down bags and shuffled toward the exit, they knew they had been part of something extraordinary, something that would not remain confined to the fuselage of a single jet. This story was already too big, too charged, too symbolic. At the front of the line, Elena and Adrian Carter stepped into the jet bridge together, hand in hand. A small cluster of executives awaited them. Hushed voices, nervous glances, tablets clutched with notes. The battle in the sky was over, but the war on the ground had just begun. The jet bridge was colder than the cabin air had been. Elena felt it the moment she stepped across the threshold, an unnatural chill that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the chill of scrutiny. At the end of the bridge stood a group of executives in immaculate suits, their postures stiff, their faces painted with corporate concern. They weren't here for routine deplaning. They were here for damage control. Adrian adjusted his grip on her hand, an anchor in a sea of staring eyes. The executives bowed their heads slightly, a mix of deference and apology. The tallest, a man with silver-framed glasses and a tablet clutched to his chest, stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, on behalf of Atlantic Sky, I want to sincerely apologize for what occurred tonight. We have a team assembled to ensure this is handled properly." His voice was careful, every syllable polished as though rehearsed on the walk from the terminal office. Elena's instinct was to shrink from the spectacle, the public apology, the hushed tone. It all reminded her that she was no longer just a woman who'd been humiliated. She was a symbol now, one that came with its own weight. She gave a small nod, her jaw tight. "Thank you," she said softly, though the words felt mechanical. Behind them, the first passengers began trickling into the bridge. Some stole glances at the scene, some outright stared, others quickly pulled phones from pockets to type, thumbs flying across screens. The whispers that had started in the cabin were now transforming into posts, tweets, Messages. Witnessed a flight attendant fired on the spot by the CEO himself. First class. Absolute chaos. She dumped water on a black woman in 1A. Then boom. CEO husband shut it down. Never seen anything like this. Whole plane went silent. Within minutes, the story had begun to slip beyond the walls of the airport. A digital tide was forming, invisible to those still standing in the fluorescent tunnel, but inevitable in its force. Susan Whitfield, meanwhile, was being ushered down a side corridor of the terminal. Her escorts, the two security officers, moved with quiet authority, giving her no space to stall or appeal. Her mind, however, refused to quiet. It wasn't fair. It wasn't deliberate. It was one glass of water. People make mistakes. The narrative spun in her head like a carousel, looping faster the more she tried to hold on to it. She imagined the grievance she'd file, the union representative she'd call, the sympathetic colleagues who would vouch for her decades of service. She clung to each image like a lifeline, but every time she closed her eyes, the truth replayed. The deliberate tilt of her wrist, the icy cascade soaking the cream blazer, Elena's quiet words. There was no turbulence. The officers paused at a glass-walled conference room near baggage claim. Sarah Lynn was already inside, her briefcase open on the table, papers neatly stacked. She gestured for Susan to sit. Susan's voice cracked the silence. "This is a mistake. I've been loyal for 20 years. You can't just end that on one passenger's word." Sarah's gaze didn't waver. It wasn't just one passenger. We have multiple witness statements, including a licensed attorney who documented the entire incident. We also have cabin video. Your actions are clear. The words hit like cold steel. Susan's mouth opened, but no defense came out. The carousel stopped spinning. Back in the terminal, Elena and Adrian were guided toward a quieter lounge away from the growing crowd. But the silence inside the lounge wasn't peace. It was sterile, suffocating, filled with the tension of executives shifting nervously in their seats. "Mr. Carter," one of them began cautiously, "we are prepared to issue an internal memo immediately, framing this as a personnel matter. We recommend discretion. Settlements are often less volatile than public spectacles." Adrian's eyes were sharp. This wasn't a personnel issue. It was an act of malice against a passenger. Against my wife. The word wife lingered, heavy in the air. The executives shifted, realizing he wasn't speaking as CEO in this moment. He was speaking as a husband whose fury had not yet cooled. Helena placed a hand on his arm, a subtle gesture to temper his edge. "Adrian," she said quietly, "let's not turn this into another circus. Not yet." He met her gaze, the steel in his expression softening. But deep inside, the decision had already crystallized. There would be no quiet settlement, no hushed memo. This would be confronted head-on. Meanwhile, in the terminal's main concourse, passengers streamed toward baggage claim, phones in hand, their voices animated. A college student in row 12 was already live-streaming to his followers. "Guys, you won't believe what just happened on my flight. Like, mid-air drama CEO fires flight attendant in front of everyone. Wild." A woman in business attire, who had been seated in Economy Plus, was dictating into her phone. First-class attendant humiliated a passenger. Totally unprovoked. CEO's wife, apparently. Whole cabin froze. Unreal. By the time luggage began circling on the carousel, the first hashtags had appeared. "Yeah, Flight 721, CEO Justice." No turbulence. Susan's name wasn't yet public, but it was only a matter of time, and she knew it. Sitting in the glass-walled room, watching Sarah slide termination paperwork across the table, She felt the edges of her world closing in. "I'll fight this," Susan muttered, her voice a mix of desperation and defiance. "The union won't let you railroad me. The public won't either." Sarah's expression softened, but only slightly. "The public doesn't decide your employment, Susan, but they may decide your reputation. That part is no longer in your control." The word stung more than the termination itself. Reputation. For years she had built hers on the crisp snap of her uniform, the confidence of command in the cabin, the subtle nods of respect from junior crew. And now, with a single glass of water, it was all disintegrating into whispers, posts, hashtags. She signed the paperwork with trembling hands, each pen stroke like carving away another piece of her identity. Back in the lounge, Elena excused herself to the restroom. Alone at the sink, she caught her own reflection. The water stain on her blazer had dried into a shadow, a ghost of the humiliation she had endured. She traced it lightly with her fingertip, her throat tightening. She thought about how calm she had stayed in the moment, how she had refused to shout or lash out, yet inside it had burned. The question still gnawed at her. Why me? Why did she look at me and see someone she could diminish? Her own quiet dignity had carried her through the cabin confrontation. But now in solitude, she let herself feel the weight. Tears welled, hot and unsummoned, sliding silently down her cheeks. When she returned, Adrian noticed immediately, though she brushed it away with a practiced smile. "I'm fine," she whispered, but Adrian knew better. And in that moment, his resolve hardened further. If Susan thought she could twist this into a story of an innocent attendant crushed by corporate power, she was gravely mistaken. He would not let Elena's pain be rewritten. Outside the lounge, the first online articles were beginning to appear, hastily typed by local news blogs sniffing the scent of virality. The facts were fuzzy, distorted by passenger retellings, but the headlines were designed to provoke CEO fires flight attendant mid-flight after first-class altercation. Drama in the sky, passenger humiliated, husband intervenes. The story was out, and the world was about to decide what it believed. Susan sat alone in her apartment, the blinds drawn tight against the daylight, the silence pressed in like heavy insulation. No phone calls from colleagues, no emails from the airline, only the echo of her own thoughts and the phantom hum of cabin air that would never again be hers. The termination paperwork lay on the table, still smelling faintly of printer ink. She had read it a dozen times, each phrase cutting deeper. Gross misconduct, deliberate endangerment, immediate dismissal. Her pen strokes at the bottom looked alien, as though someone else had signed away her identity. For the first 2 days, she replayed the moment over and over, the glass in her hand, the tilt of her wrist, the splash of cold water, Elena Carter's steady voice. No turbulence, no accident. Susan told herself it had been reflex, a slip. But even in the solitude of her apartment, the lie didn't hold, but despair soon shifted into anger. If Adrian Carter hadn't been on that flight, if he hadn't stepped out of the lavatory at the exact moment he did, she would still have her job. The humiliation hadn't come from the act itself. It had come from him, wielding his authority like a blade in front of the entire cabin. He made me into a spectacle, she told herself, her jaw tight. He decided I was disposable. The more she thought about it, the more her anger reshaped into a story. And stories, she knew, had power. Her niece, Chloe, was 19, perpetually glued to her phone, and fluent in the language of hashtags and outrage. When Susan finally called her, She expected pity. Instead, Chloe offered strategy. Aunt Susan, you can't just sit there and take it. People eat up stories of corporate overreach. You worked for them for decades, and they threw you away in front of a whole plane. That's brutal. You're basically David versus Goliath. Susan felt something shift in her chest. But the passengers saw what happened. She whispered. Chloe's laugh was quick, almost careless. The internet doesn't care about witnesses. It cares about emotion. You just need to frame it right. That night, they drafted the campaign. Chloe typed, Susan dictated. The headline was chosen with surgical precision. Fired by billionaire CEO for an accident help a 22-year flight attendant. Get justice. The body of the text painted Susan as a loyal worker, blindsided by a powerful man protecting his demanding wife. The water spill was described as a minor accident caused by a sudden jolt of the plane. Elena was never named, only referred to as the CEO's notoriously difficult spouse. Susan's decades of service were exaggerated into near-sainthood photos of her in crisp uniforms, smiling beside airplane doors, hugging children who had once visited the cockpit. Make sure they see the human side. Chloe coached, you're not just a flight attendant. You're everyone's favorite aunt who got crushed by the rich. Susan stared at the screen, her pulse racing. It wasn't the truth, not really, but it was close enough to believe, and belief was all she needed. When they hit publish, the campaign felt like throwing a stone into a still pond. The first ripples came slow, $25 from a stranger in Ohio, $50 from someone in Arizona, $10 from a user with no profile picture. But by the end of the first day, it was already at $3,000. The comments beneath the donations fed Susan like oxygen. This is what's wrong with corporations. Workers are treated like garbage. 22 years and they toss her out because the CEO's wife was in a mood. Disgusting. Stay strong. Susan, we got your back. Susan scrolled for hours, soaking in the validation. For the first time since the firing, she didn't feel invisible. She felt vindicated. Within 72 hours, the story jumped from forums to small blogs. Headlines appeared. CEO fires veteran flight attendant to please his wife. A populist news site picked it up, using one of her old headshots that Chloe had uploaded. In the photo, Susan's smile was warm, her eyes bright, a perfect image of a loyal employee wronged by power. By the end of the week, the campaign had surged past 20,000 hours. Susan's chest swelled with triumph as she watched the counter tick upward. Every dollar felt like a vote in her favor, proof that she wasn't the villain. But across town, Elena Carter felt the first sting of betrayal. It began with a text from a friend. Are you okay? I saw something online about the flight. Then another. Why are people calling you entitled? Did you see this article? Elena clicked the link with trembling fingers. The article told a version of her humiliation that felt upside down, twisted beyond recognition. She was no longer the woman who had sat quietly sketching until cold water drenched her blazer. She was now the caricature of an arrogant spouse, a difficult woman whose CEO husband had lashed out on her behalf. The comments were worse. Probably some spoiled rich woman who thinks the world owes her everything. Bet she faked outrage to get the FA fired. These corporate elites disgust me. Elena dropped the phone onto the couch, her throat tight. The quiet dignity she had clung to on the plane was being rewritten, hijacked by strangers who had never even seen her face. Adrian found her sitting in silence, her sketchbook closed beside her. What is it? He asked softly. She showed him the screen, her eyes wide with disbelief. They think I'm the problem. Adrian, They think I ruined her life." Adrian scrolled, his jaw tightening with every word he read. "This is a lie," he muttered, "a calculated, manipulative lie." But the truth didn't matter. Not yet. The narrative had escaped their control. By the weekend, Susan was invited onto a late-night cable program known for amplifying anti-corporate voices. Chloe set up the webcam in Susan's living room, adjusting the lighting to soften her aunt's features. When the interview began, Susan's voice trembled just enough to sound sincere. "I gave that airline my whole life. I missed birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, and then one little accident, one spill of water, and suddenly I'm fired in front of a whole cabin of people because the CEO wanted to protect his wife. I just want my good name back." The host nodded gravely. "It's chilling. What you're describing, a billionaire CEO humiliating a working-class woman for no reason. We reached out to Atlantic Sky for comment they've refused to respond. The interview went viral overnight. Donations doubled, then tripled. The total hit 55 hours within hours. Hashtags exploded across platforms. Your stand with Susan? Or corporate abuse? Or justice for FA? Elena's inbox filled with hate. Anonymous accounts called her names, some laced with racism, others dripping with misogyny. One post even listed her business address. She deleted her social media profiles, but the venom seeped through private messages and forwarded screenshots. Sitting at the kitchen table one night, her head in her hands, she whispered, "I feel like I don't own my own name anymore. They've stolen it." Adrian placed his hand over hers. "Then we take it back. Publicly. She made this war public, so we end it the same way." But in that moment, as Susan refreshed her crowdfunding page and watched the number climb past $60,000, she believed she had won. She believed the world was on her side. And for the first time in weeks, she slept soundly. The conference room at Atlantic Sky headquarters buzzed with tension. A dozen screens glowed with news clippings, social media feeds, and the relentless counter of Susan Whitfield's crowdfunding page. It had surpassed $75,000 overnight. Every refresh seemed like a fresh slap in Adrian Carter's face. He stood at the head of the table, shoulders squared, but his jaw betrayed the weight he carried. "She is lying," he said simply. "We all know it." Elena sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't wanted to attend the meeting, but Adrian had insisted. She was, after all, at the center of the storm. Her presence was both a reminder of what had really happened and a symbol of what was at stake. Elena's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it reluctantly. Another message. Anonymous. "Liar. Gold digger. You destroyed an honest woman's life." She locked the screen, her throat tightening. She wanted to scream, but instead she whispered, "How do you fight a mob that doesn't care about the truth?" Adrian looked at her, his eyes filled with guilt. He wished he could shield her, absorb the venom himself, but he couldn't. Not from this. "We don't fight the mob," he said. "We fight the narrative." At the far end of the table, Elena Ramirez, his head of communications, clicked a remote. The screen shifted to a slide deck. Her voice was crisp, professional. "We have 3 options. 1, remain silent and hope the outrage burns out. 2, issue a corporate statement denying her claims. 3, strategically release evidence to discredit her version. Option 1 is cowardice," Adrian said without hesitation. "Option 2 will get buried," Elena Ramirez countered. "No one trusts corporate statements, especially not when they're defending executives. It'll look like spin." Elena Carter leaned forward. her voice calm but steady. Then it has to be option 3, but carefully. If we come down too hard, they'll say we're bullying her. If we're too soft, the lie wins. The comms chief nodded. Exactly. We need a third-party voice. Someone credible, neutral, who saw everything, as if on cue. Adrian's assistant entered with a small card in his hand. Mr. Carter, this just came by courier. Adrian took it and read the neat print. Daniel Ross, partner, Hanover and Ross, LLP. On the back was a handwritten note. I was in 2B. I saw everything. I'm prepared to give a statement. Helena Carter exhaled slowly, relief flickering across her features. Finally, she whispered. Adrian held the card between his fingers, weighing it like a gavel. Set up a meeting. Today. Daniel Ross's office overlooked downtown Chicago, all glass and steel, a lawyer's citadel. When Adrian and Elena arrived, he greeted them with the calm precision of a man accustomed to high-stakes battles. I don't take sides lightly, Daniel began, his voice steady. But what I saw on that flight was not an accident. It was deliberate, and now I'm watching the truth get twisted into a weapon. That doesn't sit right with me. Elena studied him carefully. His words carried weight, not just because of his profession, but because of his demeanor. He was not dramatic. He was not emotional. He was factual. Daniel slid a printed document across the table. This is my statement, time-stamped, detailed. It outlines everything from boarding to the water incident to the aftermath. I can swear it under oath if necessary. Adrian read the pages slowly, his pulse steadying for the first time in weeks. Each line dismantled Susan's narrative. Each observation painted Elena not as a caricature of privilege, but as what she had truly been: calm, dignified, undeserving of the humiliation she suffered. Thank you, Adrian said, his voice firm. You may have just changed everything. But Daniel wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. You'll need more than my statement. The internet doesn't live on affidavits. It lives on images. Do you have video? Adrian hesitated. He knew the aircraft's cabin cameras had captured everything. Sarah Lynn from HR had shown him the footage. It was damning. Susan's wrist flick, the lack of turbulence, the calculated malice, it was all there. But releasing it carried risks. If we release it through corporate channels, it looks like intimidation. Elena Ramirez had warned. But if someone independent publishes it, it changes the calculus. Adrian met Daniel's gaze. We have video, but it can't come from us. Daniel allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Then I may know someone who can help. Meanwhile, in her apartment, Susan basked in her newfound fame. The crowdfunding total had crossed $80,000. Supportive comments flowed like a river, drowning out the occasional skeptic. Chloe refreshed the campaign obsessively, squealing each time the number ticked higher. Aunt Susan, you're a hero. Look at this, people are writing whole essays about you on forums. Susan smiled faintly, sipping lukewarm coffee. Hero. The word wrapped around her like a warm blanket. The guilt that had once pricked at her conscience was fading. Each donation felt like proof that she had been right all along, but cracks were beginning to show. A few commenters pointed out inconsistencies. Wait, didn't she say turbulence caused it? Other passengers said it was calm the whole flight. Why hasn't any actual witness come forward to support her? Susan brushed them off. Haters, she said dismissively. But the seed of doubt unsettled her. even as she told herself the tide was too strong to turn. Late one evening, Adrian and Elena sat in their living room, the city lights spilling through the window. Elena sketched absently in her notebook, the pencil trembling slightly in her hand. "I keep thinking about her," Elena said softly. "About Susan. Why me? Why did she look at me and decide I didn't belong in that seat?" Adrian reached across the table, taking her hand. His voice was low, weighted with sincerity, because she saw in you everything she resented: grace, confidence, belonging. She thought she could diminish you, but she was wrong. Elena's eyes filled with quiet tears. "She hasn't diminished me, but she's managed to make me invisible in another way. To the internet. I'm not a person. I'm a symbol, and not a good one." Adrian tightened his grip. "Then we take the symbol back. With the truth inside him. A war raged. The husband wanted swift revenge. The CEO knew it required patience, precision. Both wanted justice. And justice, he realized, was finally within reach. Menim im Troy. 2 days later, Daniel Ross published a post on his professional LinkedIn account. Its title was measured. "Almost dry truth in the age of outrage. My experience on Atlantic Sky, Flight 417. The body of the post was anything but dull. In calm, legalistic detail, Daniel recounted the flight. He described Susan's initial hostility, the deliberate motion of her wrist, the absence of turbulence. He praised Elena's composure and condemned the malice he had witnessed. Because Daniel was not tied to the Carters, his words carried a weight corporate statements never could. Within hours, the Post had thousands of shares across professional and legal circles. The first real crack in Susan's narrative had formed. By nightfall, blogs began picking it up. Headlines shifted tone. Lawyer-passenger disputes viral flight attendant story. Skeptical comments multiplied. If this guy was really on the flight, Susan's story is in trouble. We need video. But if what he says is true, she lied. Susan's campaign plateaued for the first time since it began. Donations slowed. Her niece Chloe frowned at the screen, confused. "It's probably just trolls," she insisted. But Susan felt a flicker of unease. For the first time since her firing, the tide was no longer wholly in her favor, and deep down, she knew truth had a way of clawing its way to the surface. The storm broke on a Wednesday morning, quiet at first. The independent journalist Adrian had chosen wasn't a household name, but within aviation circles, Peter Lang was trusted. He had built a reputation for meticulous reporting, free from sensationalism. His blog didn't usually attract more than a few thousand views per article. But when he posted a piece titled, "When Evidence Speaks the Truth About Atlantic Sky Flight 417, Everything Changed." The article began with context, a recap of the viral story, the crowdfunding campaign, the news interviews. Then, with measured gravity, Peter introduced what he called indisputable evidence. Below the text, a silent 30-second video clip was embedded. The footage came from a cabin camera mounted near the galley. It showed Susan Whitfield walking steadily down the aisle with a glass of water. No turbulence, no stumble. Her approach to seat 1A was calm, controlled. Then, in one smooth motion, she flicked her wrist. The water cascaded over Elena Carter's shoulder. The video froze on the moment of impact, the ice cubes scattering, Elena flinching. No sound was needed. The intent was undeniable. Within hours, the clip was everywhere. Aviation blogs reposted it. Twitter accounts stitched it into threads. TikTok creators overlaid dramatic music. pointing out Susan's deliberate movement in slow motion. The narrative that had fueled Susan's rise began to collapse under its own weight. For Elena Carter, watching the clip was both vindication and agony. She sat with Adrian in their living room as the video replayed on his laptop. Seeing herself again, flinching at the shock of cold, her blazer ruined, her composure hanging by a thread, it brought the memory crashing back. "I don't want to watch it again," she whispered, closing her eyes. Adrian shut the laptop gently. "You don't have to. The world has seen it now. They know the truth." But Elena shook her head. Do they, or will they just twist this too? Her doubt wasn't unfounded. Already, online forums had split into camps. Most were furious at Susan for lying, their betrayal sharper because they had once defended her. "We were scammed. She should be in jail for fraud." Imagine targeting someone just because of who they are. But there were still some who clung to the original story, claiming the video was staged, edited, or leaked illegally by Atlantic Sky to smear her. Elena buried her face in her hands. "Even with proof, they find a way to hate me." Adrian wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "That's not on you. It's on them." She wanted to believe him, but part of her feared that the truth, even when undeniable, was never enough to erase prejudice. Susan Whitfield saw the video for the first time on her phone. Chloe had shoved it in front of her face. Her voice panicked. "Aunt Susan, what is this? They can't just put this out there. Can they?" Susan stared at the frozen frame, her wrist mid-flick. Elena drenched. For a moment, her mind rejected it. She convinced herself it had been manipulated. "That's not how it happened," she muttered. "They edited it, but deep down, she knew the truth. She had done it. She had thought it small, petty, survivable. She had never imagined it would define her life." Chloe scrolled through the comments, her voice breaking. "They're tearing you apart. People are demanding refunds. The platform froze the campaign. It's all over." Susan grabbed the phone, scrolling frantically. The betrayal was total. The same strangers who had called her a hero now called her a fraud, a bigot, a thief. "How could they turn on me so fast?" she whispered, her chest tightening. Chloe's eyes were wet, because they feel tricked, and no one forgives being tricked. Susan collapsed onto the couch, her head in her hands. For the first time, the walls of denial cracked, and she faced the horror of what she had done, not just to Elena Carter, but to herself. At Atlantic Sky's headquarters, Adrian's team watched the backlash unfold in real time. Elena Ramirez, the comms chief, scrolled through the trending hashtags. Susan scam. Flight for her own truth. Stand with Elena. "It's working," she said, her tone cautious. "The tide has turned." Adrian didn't smile. "This isn't about winning. It's about closing the wound." But Elena Carter, seated quietly beside him, spoke with a clarity that silenced the room. "It will never close. Not completely. What Susan did isn't just about me. It's about the way people are so ready to believe the worst of someone like me. The lie spread because it fit their prejudice. The truth had to fight uphill." Her words hung heavy. No one could disagree. That evening, Daniel Ross published a follow-up to his LinkedIn post. This time, he included a link to Peter Lang's article and wrote simply, "As a lawyer, I believe in evidence. Here it is. Make your own judgment." The combination of his calm credibility and the raw video left little room for doubt. Professional circles, which had once been hesitant to weigh in, now sided firmly with the Carters. Several law firms and aviation associations issued statements condemning Susan's behavior and praising Elena's composure. Still, Elena found little comfort. She sat awake that night, staring at the city lights, replaying the weeks of being vilified, of strangers calling her names, of the fear that her reputation and her dignity could be erased by a lie. Adrian joined her at the window. "You should rest," he murmured. "I can't," she admitted. "What if tomorrow there's another lie? What if it never stops?" Adrian placed a hand over hers. "Then we keep fighting. Together. You don't have to carry it alone." She looked at him, her eyes shimmering. "But I feel alone. That's the worst part. For days, I was a villain in the eyes of the world. And I couldn't change it. Not with the truth. Not with proof. Nothing I said mattered." Adrian's chest ached at her words. He wanted to promise her it would never happen again. But he knew the world too well. Lies traveled faster than truth. Hate often drowned out dignity. What he could promise was this, that she would never face it alone again. Meanwhile, Susan's life unraveled at speed. The crowdfunding platform issued a statement freezing her funds pending an investigation into fraud. The cable news channel that had given her airtime aired a retraction, their anchor visibly embarrassed. Old colleagues stopped returning her calls. For years, she had built her identity around authority, around being seen. Now she was invisible, except as a cautionary tale. She couldn't step online without being bombarded with vitriol. She couldn't step outside without fearing someone might recognize her face from the viral stories. Late one night, she sat in the dark, scrolling through her campaign page. The comments were vicious. "You ruined a woman's life for nothing. Hope you enjoy cleaning toilets. Racist. Pay it back. Every cent." Her hands trembled. She typed a reply, something defensive, something angry, but deleted it. For the first time, she realized there was no fight left to win. Elena Carter attended a small dinner weeks later, organized by colleagues in the design world. When she walked into the warmly lit restaurant, conversations paused. For a heartbeat, she feared the old shame returning, the judgment. But then people rose, greeting her with genuine smiles, handshakes, hugs. We saw the video. One woman said, "We're so sorry for what you went through. You carried yourself with grace." Elena's throat tightened. She nodded, managing a quiet, "Thank you." For the first time, she felt the possibility of healing. Not because the internet had shifted in her favor, but because in real life, face to face, people could see her as she truly was. And that, she realized, was what Susan had never understood. Dignity wasn't about power or control. It was about presence, about refusing to let someone else dictate your worth. By the end of the month, Susan's crowdfunding total was locked in limbo, her reputation in ruins. Adrian's board breathed easier as the stock recovered, buoyed by public confidence in how transparently the Carters had handled the crisis. But for Adrian and Elena, it wasn't about stock prices or statements. It was about scars, some visible, most invisible, that would take far longer to heal. Adrian lay awake one night, Elena asleep beside him, staring at the ceiling. He wondered if firing Susan mid-flight had set all this in motion. Had his fury fueled her desperation? Had he escalated a personal cruelty into a public war? Then he remembered the look on Elena's face when the water had hit her, the quiet shock, the dignity she held on to when humiliation clawed at her. No, He decided. The war had started with Susan's cruelty. His choice had simply pulled the curtain back. And the truth, though late, had finally taken its rightful place. Susan Whitfield's apartment had grown smaller by the week. The blinds stayed drawn. Pizza boxes and coffee cups cluttered the kitchen counter. A dull grayness seemed to hang in the air, a residue of her own despair. Her phone vibrated constantly at first. Messages, alerts, notifications so many she could barely keep up. Now it lay mostly silent, except for the occasional spam call. She had stopped answering friends long ago, embarrassed by the pity in their voices, or worse, the cold edge of blame. One evening, Chloe dropped by unannounced, lugging a grocery bag with a few essentials. She set it on the counter and scanned the room with wide eyes. "Aunt Susan, you can't live like this." Susan sat hunched on the couch, still in yesterday's clothes, scrolling through a news article about herself. Her face filled the screen, caught mid-sentence in that disastrous television interview. Below it, the headline screamed, "From hero to hoax. How one flight attendant fooled the internet." "They're vultures," she muttered, her voice hoarse, "picking apart my bones." Chloe sank onto the armrest, trying to soften her tone. "You lied. Aunt Susan, the video doesn't lie." Susan's eyes flashed, but the fury was weak, brittle. "I didn't lie. I just didn't tell it the way they wanted. I was humiliated, and they wanted me destroyed." Chloe's silence was louder than any accusation. She fiddled with the hem of her sweater. "You humiliated her first?" The word stung like a slap. Susan turned away, unable to meet her niece's gaze. "I don't know why I did it," she whispered finally. "It was a moment, a stupid moment, and now it's all anyone sees." Chloe placed a tentative hand on her shoulder. "It doesn't have to be the end. You could apologize, publicly, maybe even to her." Susan barked a bitter laugh. "Apologize to Elna Carter." She wouldn't hear it. Her husband would crush me before I even finished the sentence. But a small, trembling part of her wondered if Chloe was right. Meine Torb, in Ghent, at Atlantic Sky headquarters. The atmosphere was calmer than it had been in weeks. The storm was passing, though its aftermath still lingered like debris after a hurricane. The board had reconvened, this time not to demand damage control, but to discuss the future. Adrian Carter sat at the head of the long oak table, his presence composed but solemn. Beside him, Elna Carter remained quiet, listening. Adrian cleared his throat. "The crisis has shown us two things. First, we have vulnerabilities not in our systems, but in our culture. Second, we have an opportunity. What happened to my wife should never happen to anyone on one of our aircraft. Not ever again." Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. Elena Ramirez, the communications chief, leaned forward. "The public's watching us now. We can't just patch over this. We need reform, real reform, something that changes how our crew is trained, how they see passengers, how they understand dignity." Adrian nodded. "I've been working on a framework. We'll call it the Dignity Mandate, training in empathy, inclusivity, accountability, a reporting system that escalates incidents in real time, directly to leadership, and yes, consequences that are swift and transparent." A senior board member frowned slightly. "That's ambitious. Expensive, too." Elena Carter spoke for the first time, her voice calm but edged with steel. "So was ignoring the problem. Look where that got us." Her gaze moved around the room, steady and unflinching. "If you think the cost of reform is high, weigh it against the cost of another incident like this. Our passengers are human beings first, Treat them otherwise, and we've already failed." There was no rebuttal. Her words settled into the air like a quiet decree. That night, after the meeting, Elena and Adrian sat together in their home office, poring over draft outlines of the program. Adrian rubbed his temples. "I keep asking myself if firing Susan on the plane was the right call. Maybe I escalated everything. Maybe I should have handled it privately." Elena looked up from her notes. "You reacted as my husband, not just as a CEO. I'll never fault you for that." But it gave her a story to twist. Adrian said. His voice was thick with self-reproach. "She played the victim because I made the decision so publicly." Elena reached across the desk, taking his hand. "She played the victim because that's who she chose to be. You didn't make her lie. You didn't make her launch a campaign. That was her, and the truth caught up." Adrian searched her face, the quiet strength in her expression. For weeks, she had carried herself with composure, but he knew the toll it had taken. The nights she lay awake, the messages that cut like knives, the fear of being seen as something she wasn't. "You deserved better," he said softly. Elena's eyes glistened. "What I deserve doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what we do now." Her words, simple yet resolute, steadied him more than any corporate strategy could. Menace. Across town. Susan sat awake at her kitchen table, staring at a blank notepad. Chloe's suggestion haunted her. Apologize. The idea seemed both impossible and necessary. She picked up a pen, scribbling phrases, crossing them out, starting again. "I never meant to hurt you. Too weak. I was wrong. Too vague. It was prejudice. And I see that now. Too raw. Too exposing." Her hand shook. She wanted to justify, to explain, to say it had been stress or exhaustion. But none of it would erase the image in the video, the flick of her wrist, the malice in her act. The words wouldn't come, and so she sat in silence. The only sound, the ticking of the wall clock and the hollow ache of regret. Weeks later, Elena Carter attended a conference in Chicago. She had debated whether to go. The thought of walking into a public space still made her chest tighten. But she forced herself. The event was for women in design and technology, and she knew her presence mattered. As she took the stage, the applause was warm, genuine. She spoke not about the incident, but about resilience, about how creativity thrived even in adversity. Yet she couldn't avoid touching the subject. There will always be those who try to define you by their prejudice, by their assumptions, by their need to diminish you, she said, her voice steady. But dignity is not theirs to take. It is ours to keep. The audience rose in a standing ovation. For Elena, it was more than applause. It was a reclamation. Adrian watched from the back of the hall, pride welling in his chest. He knew the scars would never fully vanish, but he also knew that Elena's strength would shape something far larger than their own survival. Susan didn't watch the conference speech. She couldn't. The very mention of Elena Carter's name twisted her insides into knots of bitterness and shame. Instead, she scrubbed toilets in an office tower downtown, part of a night cleaning crew. The smell of industrial bleach clung to her clothes. The clatter of her mop bucket echoed down empty hallways. No one looked at her. No one asked her name. For 22 years, passengers had looked at her, deferred to her authority, laughed at her jokes, bristled at her criticism. She had mattered. Now, she was invisible. Every swipe of her rag across a conference table reminded her of the life she had thrown away, and every reflection in the glass reminded her of the woman in 1A whose calm dignity had undone her. Why, she asked herself again and again. Why had she done it? There was no answer, only silence. For Elena, the answer was simpler, though no less heavy. People like Susan acted not out of strength, but out of weakness, out of resentment, insecurity, and a need to feel taller by making someone else smaller. The lesson, painful though it was, had clarified something. Reform wasn't about punishing one person. It was about reshaping the culture that allowed prejudice to fester quietly until it erupted. The dignity mandate wasn't just a program, it was a promise, and Elena was determined to see it through. The city glittered that evening, its skyline etched against a dusky sky. Inside the grand Meridian Hall, the lobby glowed with golden lights spilling from chandeliers, polished marble floors reflecting the shimmer of gowns and tuxedos. The occasion was the launch of the Carter Foundation's new initiative, a program designed to mentor young designers and engineers from underrepresented communities. For Elena Carter, it was the culmination of months of healing and hard work. She stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a calm smile. Her braided hair, adorned with subtle gold accents, caught the light each time she moved. The cream silk gown she wore was simple, elegant, and unmistakably hers. No need to compete for attention when dignity radiated from within. Adrian Carter hovered nearby, shaking hands with donors and executives, his eyes never straying too far from his wife. He knew this night was more than a gala. It was a reclamation. Elena had faced the storm, endured the venom, and now she stood taller than ever. Cameras clicked as prominent journalists and industry leaders streamed inside. A string quartet played softly in the background. Waiters floated between tables with trays of sparkling wine. For the city's elite, it was another glamorous night. For Elena, it was proof that grace could outshine malice. Far from the glittering ballroom, in a service corridor hidden behind swinging doors, Susan Whitfield pushed a large gray cart stacked with folded linens and cleaning supplies. She wore the same shapeless gray smock as the rest of the night crew. Her sneakers squeaked faintly against the polished concrete floor. When she had accepted the cleaning job months earlier, she hadn't asked many questions. She couldn't afford to. Work was scarce, and the paycheck, though meager, kept the lights on. She only knew that tonight's assignment was a big event. Extra hours, double the workload. She hadn't expected this. As she wheeled the cart down the hallway, she passed a monitor mounted high on the wall. It displayed a live feed from the ballroom. She stopped dead. There, on the screen, was Elena Carter, radiant, smiling, commanding the room. The very woman Susan had poured water on in seat 1A. The woman she had mocked, dismissed, tried to diminish. And now she was the guest of honor at a gala that Susan was being paid to clean. A wave of nausea swept over her. She leaned against the cart, her knuckles white. Her supervisor, a gruff man named Jorge, appeared from the stairwell. "Whitfield," he barked. "Carpet in the West Hall needs another pass." Some waiter dropped a tray of hors d'oeuvres. "Move." She swallowed, nodded mutely, and pushed the cart toward the hall. The West Hall ran alongside the ballroom. As Susan plugged in the vacuum, the double doors opened briefly, and a wave of sound hit her warm laughter, clinking glasses, the swell of applause. And then she heard Elena's voice, amplified by the microphone. At first, Susan tried to block it out, focusing on the hum of the vacuum, but the voice carried through the doors, smooth and steady, every syllable clear. Elna was speaking about resilience, about how the foundation would help young people who had been told they didn't belong. Dignity is not a privilege, Elena said, her voice ringing with conviction. It is a right, and no one, no circumstance should strip it from you. The applause thundered. Susan froze, her hands trembling on the vacuum handle. She looked up at another monitor above the hall entrance. Elena stood center stage, a hand over her heart, her posture regal yet humble. She looked untouchable. She looked invincible. Susan's throat tightened. The sound of applause roared in her ears. She remembered the flick of her wrist on that plane, the ice water splashing onto Elena's blazer, the calm, piercing words that had followed. There was no turbulence. Now the world applauded Elena, while Susan stood in the shadows with a mop and a vacuum. She shut the vacuum off abruptly. The silence pressed against her chest. She wanted to leave, to run. But Jorge reappeared, his expression stern. Peterson. He snapped, deliberately misnaming her. Get the job done, or you're clocking out early. She bent her head and returned to work, her hands stiff, her heart hollow. Inside the ballroom, Elena closed her speech with a promise. This initiative isn't about me, she said. It's about what we build together. It's about ensuring that no young woman or man ever feels invisible in the spaces where they belong. The audience rose to their feet, the standing ovation echoing off the glass and steel. Adrian joined her on stage, his hand resting gently on her back. Together, they accepted the applause not as a victory lap, but as a testament to survival, dignity, and transformation. Back in the corridor, Susan shut her eyes tightly, trying to block out the roar, but it was useless. The sound seeped through the walls, through her skin, through her bones. She realized, in one searing moment, that her petty act had not diminished Elena at all. It had amplified her. The only person she had managed to ruin was herself. After the applause subsided, the ballroom doors closed again. The sound dulled. The hallway returned to silence, broken only by the low hum of the vacuum and Susan's unsteady breathing. She finished her task mechanically, emptied the vacuum bag, and pushed the cart back to the supply closet. When her shift ended at dawn, she clocked out with the rest of the crew. The streets outside were damp from an overnight rain. The city was waking up, commuters rushing past with coffee cups and briefcases. Susan walked among them, just another invisible shadow in the crowd. She thought of Elena standing in the spotlight, applauded, admired, remembered, and she thought of herself, swallowed by anonymity, her name now synonymous with disgrace. There was no redemption in sight, no applause, no spotlight, only the long, gray stretch of days ahead. For Elena, the night ended differently. After the last guest had left, she stood alone on the stage for a moment, looking out over the empty chairs. The echoes of applause still lingered in the air. She felt tired, but not defeated. Adrian joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "You were brilliant," he murmured. She leaned into him, her eyes soft. "We were together." They stepped down from the stage. Their work was only beginning. The city was still asleep when Susan Whitfield left the Grand Meridian Hall that morning. The sky was a pale gray, heavy with the promise of rain. She pulled her hood up against the chill, her smock damp from the mist in the air. Behind her, the glass building gleamed, catching the first light of dawn. Inside, crews were dismantling the gala decor, sweeping away the remnants of champagne and laughter. For most of the guests, it had been a night of celebration. For Susan, it had been a night of reckoning. She walked quickly, her sneakers slapping against the pavement, desperate to put distance between herself and the sound of that applause. It still echoed in her mind, cruel in its clarity. Every clap had been a reminder of the chasm between her and Elena Carter. Elena, who stood in a spotlight. Elena, who had turned a humiliation into triumph. Elena, who had proven that dignity could not be drowned by a petty act of malice. Susan, meanwhile, was trudging toward the subway station, invisible to the crowd of early commuters. No one recognized her. No one cared. And in a way, that was worse than being hated. She used to command attention, even if it was just in the narrow world of an airplane cabin. Passengers had feared her disapproval. Junior crew members had scrambled under her orders. Now she was a ghost, stripped of name and power. She sat on the train, staring at her reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back at her seemed older than her 50 years, her skin lined with exhaustion, her eyes dulled by bitterness. She thought about her sister, the accountant with the perfect suburban home. She thought about the niece who had once helped her launch that ill-fated online campaign, who no longer answered her calls. She thought about all the friends who had drifted away as her name became a synonym for disgrace. And she thought about Elena, standing tall on that stage, her braids gleaming, her voice resonant with truth. The envy burned, but beneath it was something else, something Susan hated even more. Shame. She whispered to herself, almost inaudibly, "Why did I do it?" No answer came, just the rattle of the subway car and the buzz of her own hollow thoughts. Back at the Carter residence, Elena awoke late that morning. The gala had been exhausting, but it had also left her with a profound sense of peace. She padded barefoot into the kitchen, her robe tied loosely, her hair wrapped in a silk scarf. Adrian was already at the table, reading the newspaper, his coffee steaming beside him. "You were incredible last night," he said without looking up, as though it were a fact, not a compliment. Elena smiled softly, pouring herself a cup of tea. "We were," she corrected him. It had been their battle, their storm to weather together. But even as she spoke, she knew the journey wasn't just theirs. The messages flooding her phone were proof young designers inspired, students writing to thank her, women and men who felt seen because she had refused to be diminished. The foundation wasn't just a symbol, it was a path forward, a chance to build something lasting. Adrian set down the paper and looked at her. "Do you ever think about her?" About Susan. Elena hesitated. She did, though she rarely admitted it. The image of that moment on the plane was seared into her memory, the deliberate flick of the wrist, the cold cascade of water, the smug mask of authority on Susan's face. But so too was the look on Susan's face when the truth was revealed, when power shifted, when the weight of consequence finally crushed her. "I think about her sometimes," Elena said quietly. "Not with anger, more with pity." Adrian reached for her hand. "She doesn't deserve your pity." "Maybe not," Elena admitted. "But I refused to let her actions poison me. She wanted to make me small. She failed. Holding on to hatred would be letting her win." Adrian studied her for a long moment, then nodded. He knew better than to argue with his wife's quiet wisdom. Meanwhile, Susan's days settled into monotony. Nights spent scrubbing office bathrooms, days spent in a haze of exhaustion. Her savings dwindled, her prospects vanished. Each rejection email felt like another nail in a coffin she had built for herself. Sometimes she would scroll through her phone, pulling up old photos from her years in uniform. There she was, smiling confidently in front of an aircraft, her wings pinned proudly to her chest. That woman was gone. The world had moved on. The viral storm that once consumed her had long since shifted to new scandals, but her name still carried a stain that no time could erase. One evening, as she cleaned a corporate lobby, she noticed a glossy magazine left on a coffee table. The cover story was about the Carter Foundation, featuring a photo of Elena and Adrian, arms around each other, smiling as they stood with a group of young scholarship recipients. The headline read, "From Turbulence to Triumph Building Dignity in the Skies." Susan stared at it for a long time. She wanted to tear the magazine apart, to shred the smiling faces, but she didn't. Instead, she set it neatly back on the table, her hands trembling. The realization hit her like a blow. Elena had not just survived her malice. She had soared because of it. And Susan had sunk, dragged down by her own bitterness. The symmetry was cruel, but undeniable. Weeks later, Elena attended a small mentorship session with a group of young women at a community center. She listened to their stories of being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed, and she shared her own. She told them about that flight, not with anger, but with honesty. She told them how dignity is tested not when everything is easy, but when everything is against you. One young girl raised her hand. "Were you scared?" she asked. Elena paused, then smiled gently. "Yes, but courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to move forward anyway. To choose grace when you could choose rage. To choose dignity when you could choose despair." The room was silent, the girls hanging on every word. That night, as Elena left the center, she looked up at the stars scattered across the sky. For the first time in months, she felt something settle deep in her chest. Not victory, not vengeance. Something better. Peace. Susan, meanwhile, returned to her small apartment after another endless shift. She collapsed onto the couch, the silence pressing down like a weight. On the table was an unopened envelope, another overdue bill. She turned on the television for noise, flipping through channels until she landed on a news segment. It was about the Carter Foundation's expansion, highlighting a new partnership with several major airlines to implement mandatory empathy and bias training for flight crews. Elena appeared on screen, speaking calmly, confidently, her presence commanding even through a screen. Susan muted the television and stared at the image. Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. She couldn't. The tears had dried up months ago. She turned off the TV and sat in the dark. Her kingdom was gone. Her power was gone. And the world had no memory of her beyond that single act of malice. Elena Carter would be remembered. Susan Whitfield would be forgotten. And perhaps, Susan thought bitterly, that was the cruelest justice of all. At 35,000 feet, one flight attendant's malice tried to reduce a woman to nothing more than a stereotype. But Elena Carter chose dignity over rage. And that choice exposed the truth not only about one person's prejudice, but about a system too often blind to justice. Her strength turned humiliation into change, proving that grace can be more powerful than hate. And what of Susan Whitfield? Her downfall is a reminder that cruelty leaves scars not only on its victims, but on the one who inflicts it. She sought power through prejudice and found herself powerless, erased by her own choices. This story is not just about an airplane cabin. It's about our workplaces, our schools, our streets everywhere. Dignity can be stolen or defended. It asks us when faced with injustice, will we stay silent, or will we stand with those who deserve to be seen? If Elena's story moved you, share it. If it made you think, leave a comment. And if you want more powerful stories that challenge prejudice and celebrate resilience, hit like, share, and subscribe. Together, we can make sure voices of dignity and justice never fly unheard.